really funny. I'm kidding. I did this. All right.
Well, there's a little red recording now. Now I can see.
Yeah,
I was wondering where the time clock was.
Yeah, me too. I was like, where's the fucking time clock?
All right. So welcome to Gold, Goats, and Guns, episode 199. We're starting in medias res because Tom doesn't know how to press a fucking record button. So take two.
Take two.
Welcome to minute one of our 30-minute conversation that's already happened without the benefit of recording. This is Dex. Tom is over there smoking his cigar. We're going to talk about cabinets, members, that is, not places you store things, Syria, stuff like that. You want to start again?
Sure. Yeah. So there we are. Ready? Well, okay, Dexter, thank you for your forbearance and my inability to.
I'm glad I noticed it only 30 minutes in and not like 60.
Only 30 minutes in.
It's like, where's the little timer that's usually on the screen?
So actually, here's a funny story. So I think I've told this story before. I'll tell it again. So in the very early days of the Gold, Goats, and Guns podcast, I called up a friend of mine who knows a lot of names and I finally called in a favor and said, yes, I would like to get Dr. Mark Faber on the podcast. And so we set it up, and I go through his publicist or his assistant, blah, blah, blah. And we sit down, and Mark and I have a lovely conversation. And I'm so excited to talk to Mark Faber, I forget to hit the record button. We have like an hour and 10-minute conversation. It's pretty good, and we have a great time. And I get to the end of it, and I realize right before we leave the conversation that I haven't hit record. And I tell Dr. Faber this, and I cop to it, and all the rest of it, and I said, well, there it is, and so really sorry about that. Thank you for the conversation. I guess we'll try and do it again. And I was so freaking embarrassed by that. I've never asked him to be on the show again. Not because of any other reason, but because I was such a fucking dumbass. And I'm like, oh my fucking.
We'll have to engineer you being a guest on someone's podcast that can get him on. So it's understood you don't get to push any buttons, but anyway,
this was like 4 or 5 years ago now, so I mean I could easily probably call him again.
So I'm going to prompt you to we had started by talking about specifically about Bessent for Treasury, and I think you should just kind of hit the reset and give your spiel.
Sure. So what I was thinking about, it's funny, this morning on Zero Hedge, we were looking for topics to talk about this morning. And I noted of all the things on Zero Hedge that I stood out to me was an article on Zero Hedge. And I'll make sure that I put a link in the show notes to this is that Bessent is, it's kind of a quick rundown of what Scott Bessent thinks. And so we've all heard about the 3-3-3 plan, which is, to run 3% growth, a 3% budget deficit, and add 3 million barrels of domestic oil production a day. And that's all interesting. And, we can argue whether or not all those things are possible. I know they're possible. I don't think that's even hard to do any of those things. The 3 million barrels a day may be difficult of actual crude oil production as opposed to, natural gas liquids or, whatever they're calling oil production these days, because they keep changing the definition of it. But that's neither here nor there. All those things are very possible. What's interesting about Bessent, and the people have been worried about him because he used to, he was there with George Soros during the taking down of the Bank of England and all that. And and in my mind, that doesn't really interest me because I know Jim Rogers and I've met Jim Rogers and I know that Jim Rogers is not a Soros kind of guy. So, but what was interesting to me was that Bessent was talking about the linchpin to what is normally the IMF financial repression model for fixing a country's fiscal problem, which is they always say, hey, cut the budget deficit, but at the same time, you go through austerity, cut the budget deficit, but at the same time, you have to raise taxes. So you got to cut government spending, cut GDP, and then at the same time, raise taxes in order to protect bondholders and keep capital flight from happening. Well, that's as far as I'm concerned, that austerity is very much a recipe for destroying a country and prepping it, honestly, if you want my honest opinion, prepping it for a color revolution down the line, or for constantly controlling the domestic political situation by keeping everybody unhappy. And Bessent's not talking about that at all. He's like, we're not going to raise taxes to, cover the government deficit, because that assumes that model, assumes that we can't meaningfully cut government spending. We're going to cut regulations. We're going to get a bunch of, bureaucrats out of the way, and we're going to lower taxes, and we're going to, in effect, the phrase is grow our way out of it, but it really is just a matter of, we're just going to stop spending money that we don't need to spend, and we're going to cut some of the waste and the fraud and everything else, and we're going to get started. And that is, to me, the really big signal that this guy is not a quote unquote neoliberal. He's not part of the cabal. He's not a Trojan horse. If he was talking about having to hold taxes at this level, or comply with OECD rules on tax harmonization and all the rest of it, then I'd be like, yeah, fuck this guy. But he's not. And so he's talking about the exact opposite. He's talking about doing exactly what I would do if I were Treasury Secretary: cut spending, cut taxes, get the fuck out of the way, let dynamism return. Let's get small business growth and small and regional bank lending back into our economy, and blah 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 blah. So.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing, whatever we think of Soros today, breaking the Bank of England was a different era, and it was very math based. I mean, there's a lot of people who conjecture about like a political motivation, but ultimately, that was about Britain and the exchange rate mechanism, like post Maastricht, but pre-Euro. And, I think it's a very rational position to say that, like, the Germans at the time were more rational budgeters than the English, and if you want to place your bets and you do, and it works out for you, like, math wins, sometimes. Yeah. And regardless of other motivations or other things you might think about Soros at the time, like, the thesis was very hard to argue with, regardless of, whatever possible co-conspirators behind the scenes people might imagine. But look, it's, you want a fixed exchange rate forever based on a profligate spending model that's different from somebody who doesn't spend that way. Like, there's a gap there. There's something you could exploit if you're a good arbitrager, like Soros was. And, Quantum made $1 billion on that bet. And so be it. And if Bessent was on that team, and I don't know, I mean, I haven't dug into it like you have on his actual CV, like if he was there, that, Black Wednesday or whatever, but that era, at least, I think, Soros wasn't what he is today, where he's giving us DAs who don't want to put people in prison for clear crimes,
Right. So, I mean,
like let the boogeyman be the boogeyman, but like focus on the part that matters, which is like the more recent past.
Sure.
Like, I don't think anything about that era is like in any way disqualifying for somebody who's also been in finance for another 30 years after.
I mean, like you could be an honest to God. I mean, this is the thing. You could have been there and had been a rapacious shitbag at that point in your life. I mean, look, we've talked about this in terms of Donald Trump. Like, at one point in the past, Donald Trump was not a guy that anybody really, one, took seriously, or two, didn't ascribe crappy motivations to. Like, people can be bad people at one point in their life and then have a moment of clarity, as what alcoholics would call a moment of clarity, and then realize that, look, I've been a bad man for these, and like, I don't want to be that guy anymore. Yeah. Like, men go through stages in their life. This is
I'm not gonna sit here and be like, oh, Donald Trump has completed the hero's journey, and he's now I'm not sophisticated, chin stroking, pipe smoking, like wizened old man. But like, here's the thing, like, Trump's corruption was very within a domain of very pragmatic, whatever, whoever he paid to get concrete delivered at 3 a.m. in Manhattan, I don't give a shit. He saw what like our world was and how it really worked at the highest levels. And he, spoke out against it, like, a lot in the 90s. Yeah. Like, I mean, none of this is a recent conversion. And, maybe he's still a corrupt shitbag, but his motivations vis-a-vis the national government are just, it's not about putting up buildings. It's he has, and it's not necessarily a viewpoint we share 100% of, but he has a view of America. Some parts of his trade theory are a little antiquated, but at the same time, he's laser focused on things that have literally failed. And free trade is not what we were promised. It doesn't work to equalize parties, right? There's obviously a global, neo-feudalist model built into both commodities and finished goods in the free trade world. And, the left has noticed it. The right has noticed it. Everybody's noticed it. So we don't have to pay lip service to it just to keep like some libertarians happy. Like that's the thing I value least in my life. I have zero neurons in my brain dedicated to like what libertarians think.
I agree. And it's funny. And,
and I encourage others to mind map the same way because, irrelevance deserves no attention.
Yeah, fair. So one of the things that's, that we're seeing at this point in time, right, is that, these same people, and certainly the media and everything else is, I think, one of the things I know you want to talk about, which is, how we're seeing the death of the media as gatekeeper for this old regime of neo-feudalism, and they just don't know how to deal with the fact that we're in a different world. It's funny, earlier in the week, one of our patrons found this old speech by Philip K. Dick, one of the last ones he gave in public, where he explained to the world that he had what he felt was a mystical experience back in 1974, and he gave the speech in 77. And he said, look, you can call me crazy if you want. But it's really interesting. That speech tells us that, in his mind, we've moved into a different time track with each of these major events that have occurred. And, the way I tweeted it out was, well, Crooks missed, Trump lived, and we now have superimposed a new reality on the world. And and they haven't gotten the memo yet. They're still like playing the same game, and because they don't know what else to do, and they don't realize that we have moved on to a different, a different zone of consciousness, or whatever you want to call it. The zeitgeist has shifted against them, and they haven't figured that out yet.
I know I'm going to regret asking you a Philip K. Dick question. Audience, I apologize. I got a buzzer here to stop him before he goes into a 19-minute soliloquy. But was that speech right about when he was gestating Valis?
Probably. So the event happens in March of 1974, which he then writes about.
Because Valis is like 82, 81, somewhere like
81.
that.
81. So he was probably heavily writing the exegesis at that point. He had just finished working on Deus Irae with Roger Zelazny, and then he didn't publish. Valis was the next book, not the next book he published. Yeah, the next book I think he really published was Valis in 81.
Okay.
And so I think Valis probably
there's my Colombian cowbell. It's actually got two notes, so we can do that. Anyway, sorry, the batteries are broken in the buzzer. Okay, back to the time. Okay, so there was a relevance about Phil, and anybody who's read any book by him understands that there's always a shifting reality undercurrent of a Phil Dick novel, and whether it's drug induced or spiritually induced or transdimensionally induced, but the world we live in now is 6 months down the line from where we were. Just things are different. Like we're on a different timeline for sure, and it's going to be interesting going forward. We're looking through all these cabinet members, and I think I said the first time around that I was a little concerned with. I'll say there were a lot of Fox, broadcast personalities on the list is one way to look at it, and then the more I looked into everybody, I honestly am less and less concerned. I mean, Bessent was. The first thing you hear is, he worked for Soros. Hegseth, they've done huge hit pieces on. Mm-hmm. Obviously, they hate Tulsi, and they apparently deposed Assad just so they could pretend they found something in Assad's filing cabinets that disqualifies her. Just kidding. But look, at the zero bound, bad ideas are free, right? Like, when we live in a world of riskless stupidity, don't ever think they won't do it. Like, there's no relation. I mean, the whole concept of everything we're talking about at some level is nothing more than, if nothing costs anything, if there's no skin in the game, I'm not kissing Taleb's ass here, but like, it's true. Like, if you have no risk, you can't calculate whether something is good or bad. And, the thing about, what you were talking about earlier, everything that they do is just predicated on money not having a cost. And so any dumb idea they can keep doing, what makes a dumb idea? Well, a dumb idea is something that doesn't work. Why doesn't something work? It's too expensive for its goals. Well, if you distort all that, if you make money, a joke, and you just enslave everybody to keep paying into the money grinder, forget the money printer. Like, don't forget that they take the money you have that isn't worth very much, and then they burn it just out of spite. Like, the money printer is always, oh, it's a big problem. Printer go brr. It's like, no. What about the hand in your pocket? Like, even though the money is devaluing, like, it's still yours, right? And you converted some useful activity into a depreciating asset because this is the system they want. And because we are living on a new timeline, Jay Powell said it best: just close the fucking door. We don't have to listen to these people. Like, their influence is waning, and what's coming is going to be a lot of stuff. Like with RFK, I feel like I just said this maybe a half an hour ago, but try to summarize the kill shot. What I had said was, like, a lot of the histrionics coming out of the media for all the cabinet appointments, whether they're, nominal Democrats like RFK or Tulsi, or just, non-RNC picked, like the rest of the slate, right? Nobody on the slate except for Rubio and who's for CIA?
The Ratcliffe.
Yeah, only those two are honestly like RNC approved, right? Like, is anyone else like RNC approved? Everyone else is like out of left field. Like, we got a couple of Democrats, we got Elon, we got, not that he's a cabinet level, but Trump is setting up quite a team to change, the way these administrative agencies are operate. And people, the histrionics in the media about RFK, or they don't seem to understand what HHS does. Like, they imagine powers outside of the scope of the agency. Mm-hmm. But inside these meetings, I hope that somebody focuses on pharma and advertising. If we get rid of pharma advertising in this country, that's a kill shot for the media. The media goes from being the legacy media to being the X media, because at this point, the only industry funding the whole MSNBC industrial complex, what's left of it is Pfizer, right?
Right.
I mean, that's it. That's what they have. And then, GM, I guess, and some Procter and Gamble products. But if you want to, I hope that somebody in this administration understands that getting rid of pharma advertising in this country would pay immense benefits to everything that they want to do as far as an agenda goes, because it's not like pharma would then distribute that money to the shareholders, right? There's so many things that could be done in this country, like a national formulary. There's a ton of insurance reform we need to have. We have 50 state models and everything, and obviously HHS would interface with the health insurance market. But I hope that, at least at the DOJ level, separate from tearing down inefficiencies that are intrinsic to the organizational structures of these departments, I hope that we look at, bad legislation and bad assumptions of how insurance and reinsurance work in this country. And that's not just for health, that's for casualty, that's for, all the disaster stuff and all the, frankly, all the stuff that we've done at the state level, citizens in Florida providing, windstorm relief when private insurance leaves the market. Mm-hmm. If we had a 50 state risk pool, if we had a single national risk pool is what I really mean. If we got rid of the 50 state divisions, every form of insurance would get more efficient, and unfortunately you'd have to revisit Obamacare and all the like just bloviating that would, engender, but it would be necessary, and we would be better off as a country. There's so much waste in the system, so much duplication, and think about like, if you go to like the New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania, like people cross a bridge 6 times a day and they go to a different state. Like, why aren't these places on common risk pools, And then if you think about that, you're like, why is the whole country not on a common risk pool? Why do we have all these, the amount of stupid paperwork that we do for every form of coverage is just lunacy.
Well, I think you brought up in the alternate timeline of this podcast the idea that that what Trump did during COVID, and he got a lot of help from Rand Paul on this, actually, about allowing doctors who aren't
they got rid of cross-state licensing for an emergency
licensing and all that stuff. It was really important, and it really helped our ability to react to COVID in a very practical way. And like, well, why aren't we? It's weird. Like, why do we even have that in the first place? It just seems like an unnecessary complication, and it's important, And in that alternate timeline, I also brought up that, like, look, Musk has been making this the runaway cost of healthcare and education on a per capita basis a big deal. He's been using X Twitter as a massive platform to make this real for a lot of people. Like, look, we're just spending a whole lot of money here. And I've been on the rant recently. This is one of my talking points of recent weeks. Is like, look, we already have UBI in the United States. We just call them government workers. Like, there are all these people who don't even, they don't even push papers. They just have a mouse moving app on their computer to, prove to the auditor that they're at their desk when they're not. They're watching The View and, making coffee.
And they've moved out of Maryland to Ohio, and they still get paid the DC Metro rate. And they come into town for the 2 mandatory days a month they have to show up, but they schedule them so the last 2 days and the first 2 days of the month are one trip. So they fly in for 7 days. They do 2 days, 3 days, 2 days kind of thing with a weekend thrown in. And then they're back on the plane. And, they're just defrauding the government out of the local cost adjustment, because they never said, oh, by the way, I live in a place that's 25% cheaper. They just take the money.
Right. And they easily do the cost benefit analysis that trip is that, 6 of those trips a year is far less than the cost of living adjustment that they're getting paid.
Right.
Yeah, it's not. This is not tough. People know how to game systems. So
making them come to work is going to be a massive, a massive adjustment. Like, because I'll put it this way: an employer has a right to demand the presence of its workers, and whatever happened during COVID notwithstanding, I mean, if these workers weren't supposed to move and they moved, like, they don't have an argument. It's like, it's one thing if there was a whole structure of like, oh, we changed all the rules and now we're changing them back. Like, they'd have an argument, be like, dude, you're doing this too abruptly. We all made adjustments. But for the guys who are just full on double dipping, they're getting shook out of the tree.
Well, and it's funny here. Here's the way to
good luck on your way down, jackass.
Here's a way to fix some of the commercial real estate issues that now we're at 5.5%, and all these commercial real estate guys are underwater. Move a lot of these government agencies that are nominally supposed to be in the DC market and move them to Wichita. Oh, you moved to Wichita because it's nice and cheap. Hey, how about we take that building that the developer is underwater on? How about the government buy that building and push that office there? Yeah. And oh, by the way, all the people who are still in Maryland, guess what? Y'all get to move to Wichita.
Yeah, the Department of the Interior, the Department of Energy needs to be dissolved, and the majority of its budget put into DOD, because the Department of Energy is really about making nuclear weapons, and people think it's about windmills. It's like 5% windmills and 95% nukes. It's just our cutesy, like, Cold War, relic of like, how do we get this stuff off budget? But let's like who gives a shit? Put it in DOD where it belongs, and just nuke the agency and just be done with it. But the Interior, like, why shouldn't that be in Montana? Like, there's a bunch of them that should be devolved out to somewhere else. I think state and defense need to stay in DC just for obvious reasons. But
sure.
Does HHS need to be there? Well, I mean, there are a ton of reasons why I do think HHS needs to stay in the broader like Maryland area, like just the amount of structural, like there's a ton of facilities and institutes that have been built up that, we're not going to move. But look, if you got 6 or 8 agencies out of DC, you'd massively change those 6 or 8 agencies' inertia, and that would be a good thing.
Yeah.
And like I said, I don't think the department, people also imagine like the Department of Education. We don't have a national education standard. Like if you really look down at what the Department of Education does, if you don't think, look, why are we doing any of this? This thing doesn't do what people think it does.
Right.
We could very easily live without it.
Yeah. They assume that, they must do all of these things because that would be rational. Like, no, mostly they just hand out grants. There's a lot of. I was talking to some people who were close to the transition team, and you realize like these guys absolutely want to go into the NGOs and to these departments, and they want to stop the grants. They want to review all of how the money is spent, and they want to know how the money has been spent. And there's going to be a 5-letter word that hits the national consciousness in late January, and that word starts with A and ends in T. It's called audit. And that's going to change a lot of what's going on here, because if an agency or a department or whatever comes under a government audit, like that's going to take more time than they have money in the bank account to fund the department, and it's going to drop dead, and the money is going to stop flowing in. When they're under audit, they're not going to get any more appropriations. One of the lovely things about separation of powers is that Congress can appropriate the money, which is what it's supposed to do. It appropriates the money and then finds and then raises the money, and the executive branch spends it. Well, the executive branch comes around and goes, "I'm not spending that money on this because I have a reason why. I don't have no idea where the money goes." And again, it's what I said earlier about monetary control of. Did we do that in this timeline? Maybe not.
Yeah.
So it's a good question. Now it's all.
I know we've been recording for 4 hours, so what do I know?
I know.
It's only 27 minutes into the actual recording.
What's important here to understand is that when you have government aligned along one line, along one agenda, which in this case, let's just call it, for lack of a better term, globalist versus sovereigntist. You have globalist control over Congress, you have globalist control, and the Treasury Department, you have globalist control over the Federal Reserve. You get zero-bound interest rates and massive budget deficits. And we've had, for the last 4 years under the Biden junta, we've had a transition in the monetary versus fiscal issue where we've had sovereigntists in charge of the Federal Reserve and the money printing, and we still have globalists in charge of government spending and a treasury and how that money is raised and appropriated and everything else. And then the executive branch, of course, continues to want to spend it that way in order to undermine monetary policy. Well, coming in, one of the points about Bessent is that you're going to have a Federal Reserve chair and a Treasury secretary who are both sovereigntists. So we should expect that the world is going to change. We expect that the way government operates changes. And by the way, we all in the financial commentary space need to get with the new paradigm in terms of our analysis. Well, it's the same thing for these government offices, like the Congress, and you can see the strategy from the Democrats and you see the strategy from the globalists. And they're still trying to maintain the control and of the way the money is appropriated and what laws they want to pass in order to try and force the executive branch. And they're literally trying to force the executive branch to spend money that the executive branch doesn't want to spend. And they're going to run right into the separation of powers. And this is going to be a very, very interesting fight. So now we have a globalist Congress, still nominally, at least at the marginal sense, when you have people like Murkowski and Collins and whatnot operating as globalists within the Republican Party in cahoots with all the globalists and the Democrats. You've got that problem, and that's a problem that needs to be solved.
Well, that's the best reason to devolve as many of these departments outside of DC as possible. It's not so much about efficiency. It probably will create inefficiency, but if you get the lobbyist industrial complex out of DC, you compromise their ability to interface with Congress, and that's just a fundamental good. and I'm looking through the 15 departments and I'm looking at their employee counts. Like, for instance, the State Department has 30,000 employees. It seems like a lot. Treasury has 100,000, but as soon as you realize those guys aren't all in DC because they have all the, they have the different Treasury banks and whatever. And like, Interior, 70,000, Agriculture, 100,000. The military has 3.2 million employees. They're obviously not all in DC. They're everywhere. Right. The VA has 235,000 employees. Again, they're working at VA facilities across the country, right? So how many are in DC? I don't know, but Homeland Security, 250,000, but that includes all the TSA people working at your airports. So how many are really in DC? I don't know, but all these departments, HUD, transportation, energy, HHS, education, the VA, none of the, who really needs to be in DC? State, probably Treasury, Interior and Agriculture by, Justice, we should talk separately, Commerce by, Labor by, Defense, yes, Defense has to stay in DC, HUD by, Transportation by, Energy just by all the way, HHS probably in the general area, just given how many things we've built there surrounding it. Education by the VA. I personally have said for a long time the VA should be part of DoD. They should bring all veteran and active duty care together under TRICARE, and then just the VA should only run hospitals that are specialty hospitals, in my opinion. So advanced limb and brain trauma type centers for veterans who were injured in service. We should have centers of excellence, and then everyone else should be on post-discharge, should just be on like a nice TRICARE package where it's like, go to any hospital. You have great coverage. Done. Get rid of the VA, all of the VA facilities where they're just giving duplicative care. It's dumb. What do you need a VA emergency room for someone getting in a car accident? It's like, it's a car accident. It has nothing to do with their time in service. Just give them kick-ass insurance and just send them to the nearest trauma center. Now, obviously, they don't actually have VA trauma centers, but like for just general medicine, like if it's not related to your service, and if it is related to your service, I'm all for spending massive amounts of money on centers of excellence for brain injury, like above and beyond. Because look, we asked that of our veterans. We should be willing to pay for that. But the system is a fucking mess. And separately, I've worked professionally in the records transfer process from enlisted to VA systems. And I mean, there's so much room for just improvement by eliminating systems. Just go, oh, you're a veteran? Yeah, we have your records. Boom, done. And it's all doable. But anyway, that's another podcast. But yeah, most of these, regardless of the employee count, because obviously a lot of them already devolved, the best bang for the buck for us as citizens is getting all these departments and all the lobbyists who target these departments, make their lives as inconvenient as possible, get them out of DC, make them fly back and forth from Kansas City. If you put the Commerce Department there or wherever you put it, probably not. But, if you put Agriculture in Kansas City and Interior in, I don't know, Montana, make them get on a freaking plane and then do whatever they need to do with with the face-to-face with the department, and then make them go fly to DC and, stay in the Trump hotel. Sorry.
Yeah. It's also funny. Like you move those things out of DC. Like one of the things that's always bothered me, and I bring up all the time, is the because of the Federal Reserve and how it was betrayed by FDR and how we got the monolithic Fed funds rate, has created a kind of internalized mercantilist system within the U.S. about there's no competition for capital.
Right. Well, there's no economy of scale because all this shit's in DC. The only economy of scale is on lobbyists being able to run our government. So whatever this is not about like efficiency to the bottom line. This is about forcing inefficiency on the people who make all of our taxes higher, make all of our budgets higher, because all they do is connive and manipulate all these departments with jobs of, promises of future employment in the private sector is a whole nother thing they have to address, because that's how most of the most nefarious bullshit gets done in our government to private sector pipeline. Like I'm all for a 10-year ban over a certain pay level. Like if you're, secretary of anything, you don't get to go work at Raytheon after you do your stint at DoD. You don't get to walk out of one and cross the street and like Monday morning, be, oh, I'm on the board at Raytheon. It's like, no, you're not.
Right. Or some NGO that works for Raytheon. It's even more, pernicious than that. No, they'll figure out. I mean, governments are good at two things. The older I get, I mean, what you would call
just let them write books that nobody reads and overpay them. Like it's just the Hillary Clinton, bullshit. Like, what
you would call my latent libertarianism. I've come to the point where, when people ask me what government's good at, I'm like killing people and creating black markets. Like that's pretty much it. And everything else is irrelevant. But what I would say is, hey, look, we've been stealing from Mississippi for 90 years now. Why don't we move one of these areas to why don't we move one of these departments to Biloxi and improve the GDP of Mississippi, and we can get this nonsense talking point out of the zeitgeist that the blue states produce all the tax revenue and the red states steal from it. They're like, there's a reason for that. It's because we put our thumb on the scale of the capital flow to the particular for the areas that support the existing system. So why don't we democratize that and put some money back into the if we're going to steal the money, why don't we put it back into the places that have been stolen from?
Right.
Like it pisses me off. Like it's because it's just dumb and it's sad. And when you see an arbitrage like that refuses to close. This is something that Vince Lanci and I talked about on one of the previous episodes of the podcast. And it's a very important point because we were talking about it on the podcast in terms of the gold market, the global gold market, and how there's a permanent arbitrage between Shanghai and the American markets and why that exists. But in general, you can make that argument about everything. When you see an arbitrage like that never closes, that's because there's a regulatory framework which ensures that the money flows in one direction versus the other. And that's the fundamental problem. And we can apply that model to everything and go, well, that's an inefficiency and that's an arbitrage that needs to be closed. How do we close that? Well, we get rid of this regulation, that regulation, and that regulation. We get rid of this, and this. Okay, well, how realistic are those things? Let's put them in an order of priority of the easiest things we can get rid of first, regulations we can get rid of first, which will start opening up that market. And then we can start moving to the more grandiose ones. And this is, literally, this is the kind of thing that we can do in a very easy and rational sense. And this is one of the reasons why the more I listen to him speak, the more I am willing to admit that I was wrong about Vivek. He's done that, and he's expressed that. Like, this is the order of operations of how we fix this particular thing.
Right.
And then here's the model. Now let's apply it to everything.
Through that lens, like the TLDR and what I said before, is that devolving the concentration of these places, these agencies out of DC, what that does is it just addresses that them being in DC is essentially regulatory capture for parasites. They're all in the same place. Well, what do you think's going to happen? And the other thing is, like, you finish one job, you start the next. And that town, I know a lot of people who do political consulting, right? And the one thing that the more talent a person has, the more likely it is they've worked for both sides. There's a professional class of political analysts and strategists. And frankly, a lot of them, I think, have sunsetted out of their years of usefulness because I think that the way we play this game is changing. Mm-hmm. But like any industry, any profession, talent is talent, right? And I do think that having, nothing validates the lobbyist framework and the lobbyist way of getting things done. Nothing that validates it more than Washington, D.C. And if we can change that, condition on the ground, who knows? It may have unforeseen circumstances. It surely will. But what if we're right about half of this? There might be massive problems, but I think most of these, these are budgeted departments, right? Mm-hmm. They have budgets. There's no reason why they can't have their heads fly to DC quarterly and give an in-person report, right? The department doesn't need to be there. Get your 5, direct reports on a plane, go to DC, or why can't the government use Zoom or a secure version thereof more often? Why do we have to pay all this travel? Forget it.
And it's it's just a classic example of bad ideas never die when when money is free it's just it's so very obvious that we can there are plenty of people out there and that want to
risk and profit awareness improve quality, and this is the real problem with Marxists is they view profit as theft. They don't recognize that profit is proof that a system has been cost tested. If something doesn't make profit, it's you have an argument of, well, is it necessary? If the market can't define a price that it can pay for this good or service that includes a little bit of vig for the thing that got it done, then it's not really pricing that good or service in a way that says it wants it. If it's not willing to pay for that, and this is the problem. This is not to say that oligopolies don't exist or monopolies don't exist or price gouging doesn't exist. It's that price gouging is only possible when there's a monopoly, and a monopoly is usually, but not always, and I strongly disagree with a lot of, what people say about disasters and gouging, and we're going to leave that aside, and I'm preventing you from doing the rant I know you'll do. But like the reality is monopolies exist for very short periods of time. And in a market that's, gently regulated, there will be new supply coming in pretty quickly.
Yes.
But this is what regulation that is, I would say irresponsible prevents, because if a market exists and is allowed to exist, then why shouldn't there be competition in it? We can have conversations of like saying, oh, well, we don't think you should be able to sell, nuclear weapons to civilians. I can have that conversation. I can come to the conclusion that, yes, that's a market we should prevent. But if we allow it, why would we not allow competition? In general, obviously, the next is a ridiculous example.
So let's apply that to cable companies or to,
Right. Well, and if you base an industry on eminent domain in any way, then you have to wind up with the shit show we got in the early 80s when the courts rightly said, look, AT&T, you guys have the backbone of the internet, the GSP level fiber corridors, and you have to let MCI and GTE and all the rest of these, formerly what they call GSP, global service providers, they have to be able to pass data across your network. Why? Because your network runs across a condemned pathway, and we're not going to condemn another pathway and let them, them MCI pay fiber and lay a whole redundant fiber network. No, we're going to say, look, we're the government. We let you, Ma Bell, put this thing along these railroad tracks and all these other places. And now you're going to sell this excess capacity to these, there are these other market participants who have customers on both ends. And, people might not like that. And there might be a whole bunch of libertarian panty, squeezing over this, but who gives a shit? It all makes sense. If it's collectively ours, then any market participant should be allowed to use a common, at the same rate and at the same level. I mean, if they were first investor, that's fine. But if the government says no one else can come in, what the government is doing is picking a winner, and that will lead to bad service. And that's exactly what happened with AT&T, right? Like we had a very reliable long distance, but it cost 13 cents, a second or whatever it was. It was way more than, it was like $1.20 a minute, right? And so that was the status quo.
Yeah.
And people, this is not free market stuff. This is the problem with libertarians. They they don't understand what they're talking about. It's like the most renewable resource in the world is libertarians being misinformed. When you have a common and the government's picked a winner, you have to understand that situation sometimes is unique. You can't just be like, oh, the airwaves can be filled with infinite signal. They can't.
So just to bring that rant back into the purview of you created a market that wasn't free in the first place, and then you want to apply free market principles to that market. Doesn't work. This is a conversation you and I've had in other domains in terms of like the Eurodollar, the birth of the Eurodollar system, and everything else. And people that argue, well, the Eurodollar system, for example, argued that it was a free market response to the central planning of the central banks. I'm like, no, it wasn't. It was a central bank dominated world that put guardrails and artificial boundaries up around how money flows around the world. And then when you watch the quote unquote free market of money operate within that artificial boundary space, well, then it's very predictable what you're going to get. Well, it's the same thing in telecommunications that you just outlined. I would argue very simply that, yeah, you're right. The government created this thing. It was never a free market. So actually forcing Ma Bell to open up the transport corridors, the fiber lines and everything else at spare capacity, like that is actually in effect a free market. That's an opening up of the market. That's actually almost very libertarian.
It's recognizing that the
market in the first place, it's an active force that liberalizes it. And
here's the thing: linear transit in network systems, whether they be railroads, water, electricity, internet, are fundamentally they always get to a point where there is no free market. There's always these libertarians who go, a bunch of people will get together and they'll just agree, freedom of contract, and you're never going to get a straight line, man. You're never going to do it, and you're never going to get the the Eisenhower interstate system that requires eminent domain. And I just don't, being like, well, but this violates the NAP. I don't care. This is why I'm not a libertarian, because these are dumb arguments. And this is why when I was 21 and I went to libertarian meetings and I thought I was a libertarian, I was like, yeah, these guys have a lot of blocks in their arguments where they're just self-referential. It's we're right because we're right, and it's like that doesn't work, bro. And when it comes to eminent domain, it's a very major thing. It's a big part of all the things we say we like about modernity. Are sequentially based on eminent domain, and that's that should be guarded against. That power is immense, but once it's done, the government needs to not pick favorites, and that's what I try to remind people of over and over again.
Right, and we have the separate philosophical discussion about whether or not we should do eminent domain in the first place, and that's
right. But you can't create straight lines across a nation without eminent domain. It's really because otherwise you're like, oh, we're going to wait 400 years to negotiate. No, fuck that. At some point you got to leave the purity spiring out of it, and it's just all right. We're not, the kids' table is over there, and we're talking about what we're going to achieve in our lifetimes. You have to start dealing in the realm of the possible. And more to the point, look, we've already done it, right? We've also, the internet is mostly laid next to, as well as a lot of power transmission is laid against the exact same corridors. We've gotten a lot of bang for the buck for this. If you ever cross a railroad, you see a little orange thing and it says, don't dig here, right? Why is that? Well, that's because the fiber optic backbone of the internet is right next to that railroad track. They literally put a freaking car with a plow and a big spool and ran it down the railroad and buried the cable in an existing eminent domain pathway, right? That's cool. It's in for a penny, in for a pound.
Right.
And then why is there then also a power line corridor right next to the same pathway? Well, guess what? We got the pathway. Let's use it.
Right. We all have, we can live in a world, again, that's the world we live in.
And I'm not arguing for unlimited government power and eminent domain, but I am arguing against the reflexive rejection of it, because that's actually does us more harm than anything, because, it's the way that libertarians neutralize a lot of intelligent people for years of their lives. They put them in this intellectual prison where they give them really dumb primary ideas. And then next thing you know, they start putting, license plates on their car that say sovereign citizen and getting, thrown in jail for a year for contempt of court because the wrong fringe is on the flag in the courtroom or whatever. It's like, put on your pants and be a grown up. That's all. Sorry, buy some pants, put them on.
I respond in my brand new flannel pajamas that I bought on Amazon.
If your knees are covered, we're making progress.
Hey man,
ever upward.
I finally got rid of the last decade's worth of flannel pajamas that were finally worn out because, well, they were embarrassing even for walking around the house. So
from malinvestment to nation building, which is what I think I'm writing about this month. Let's talk about everything we know about Syria. You have 12 seconds, which should be more than enough.
Let me just put it this way. I'm going to throw. I know I'm going to throw something at you that you probably are going to reject. But I was chatting with a patron and someone the other day who's that we chat on a semi-regular basis. He just calls me out of the blue and we chat. And he's like, I think his argument is, and I'm just going to lay it out there, is that Erdogan might have pulled off the president. Turkish President Recep Erdogan may have pulled off one of the great geopolitical moves of all time, because we have to look at this from a standpoint of uniting political Sunniism in a way that is a counterbalance to and a precursor to allowing the big powers to leave the area. And all of our reflexive initial analysis on this was that Erdogan may have stepped into a big ugly trap, and it may still wind up being that for him. But it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out. If that's correct, and again, something we talked about earlier, and I don't remember if we talked about it in this timeline or not, but whatever the Russians are doing, right, in Syria as of right now, they're clearly pulling out of their internal air bases in Syria, and they're moving everything back to Yemen and the air base of Latakia and the naval base at Tartus. If they don't move out of there, and that's I'm going to leave this to you to discuss whether you think they're going to be capable of holding on to that or not in a big geopolitical sense. If the Russians hold on to that may be your signal that there's a bigger gambit at play here where the Russians and Turkey really aren't angry with each other. But if the Russians do move out of there, then that's a different. That may be the fulcrum on the whole analysis. Depends. So
I'm looking at the text chain we had on the kind of cui bono. Mm-hmm. So I guess the first thing is like, why now? And if it's not related to the U.S. election, so that's a short analysis. I fundamentally think that Syria going down in many ways was related to various people's timelines, where the Trump timeline becomes far less predictable and far less. Whatever elements needed to be done to get this to happen, they become harder in the Trump timeline. So I think a lot of different actors were like, we got to get this done now. Right. And then obviously I think the main actors are the variety of intelligence agencies, whether they're the CIA, Mossad, in Russia's case, I think, GRU is GRU their external or is their internal? KGB is internal, right?
Yeah,
anyway, MI6,
FSB. I think FSB is there, or is it FSB? I don't remember.
Anyway, all the external, like as much as you believe in external, right? MI6 is not MI5. The CIA is not the FBI, if you will. So you have all those actors, right? You have the national actors of Israel, Turkey, the U.S., Russia. And then you have like how that goes over, I think it's, obviously very related to the most painful piece for Russia in Ukraine. So take that scenario first. If they were successful in driving the Russians out, and I don't even know which they I'm talking about because there's so much information flowing around and I kind of doubt all of it. But if you could just scenario one, if Russia had to turn tail and abandon all 4 of its major bases in Syria and lose its warm water port and get pushed back to only, Crimea plus, newly gained Sea of Azov related stuff. and now they're stuck inside the Black Sea, and they have to deal with Turkey to get out. That is a much different force projection for Africa. It's a much different, way to push, around the Med, and radically changes Russian force projection. And considering that we're at the end of the Ukraine war, they've lost, they now have new NATO members enclosing, their interest areas in around Kaliningrad and St. Petersburg. They've lost there, right? Like if you were to, history will say Putin made these bets, and he wound up with Sweden and Finland coming into NATO, horribly miscalculated, blah, blah, blah. And if on top of it, he loses the Med, then even if he gains Novorossiya, as a zone of influence or as literally part of Russia, doesn't matter how you look at it. I think that the way people do the chess, board, they're like, this is at least the worst piece we could have forced on him. So a lot of me is receptive to that. Changing the situation here is bad for Russia. Next scenario is Israel's been kind of on a run lately. They neutralized Gaza completely, Hamas in Gaza. And then they've really done an amazing job of neutralizing Hezbollah. So now the supply corridor of Hezbollah in Syria, if you want to end Iranian influence in your near perimeter, Assad falling is the last piece you need. So obviously Israel, gains, there's a lot to gain for this. And this is why, when I created a suspect list and we talked about it, it's like, this is either a CIA Mossad joint op. It's a Mossad solo op. It could be even a Ukrainian billionaire private action, because the more I look at what happened at the pipeline, at blowing up Nord Stream, there a lot of me really does not see a need for a state level actor. It could, Ukraine being big enough of an actor to pull it off on their own, because I've talked to a lot of technical divers, and I live in Fort Lauderdale area. We have an extremely, a lot of people who do a lot of technical diving down here. And I know quite a few of them. And I've asked people who don't know each other about the difficulty of that dive. And it's like, you do not need the SEALs to do that dive. Right. And you can do it off just a yacht. You can do it off a boat. You don't need any support. Everybody made it way more complicated than it was. Like, you get me the explosives, we could blow that thing up. You can tell me where it is. And I think that was just all in the realm of private Ukraine action. So maybe, I don't know how they would interface with a bunch of, Sunni militants, but, just throwing it out there. They could finance it. Right. And then Turkey and Israel, this is the most controversial one I came up with. It's like some sort of sub-Rosa Turkey-Israel joint operation where Turkey gets its zone of influence in the north and gets to murder the Kurds, and Israel gets the Golan in the south. And then the least likely I thought of was CIA MI6, mostly because I just don't see the British as competent anymore for a lot of reasons, especially in that region. Everyone, I think, is dealing with very outdated presumptions about British effectiveness. And, and if you think I'm wrong, then great. They've pulled off. Not you. I'm saying like the collective. Yeah. If you think I'm wrong about that, then fine. They've pulled off the greatest rebranding in history, and they've gone full covert to the point where everyone thinks they're morons, but they're actually getting everything done. But I the more this plays out, I think it's obvious that Turkey has had a pretty big role in the whole HTS thing. The Al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda, quasi-ISIS union, whatever you want to call them, but more Al-Qaeda than anything else. And, now what we have is a NATO member using a terrorist army to probably carry out, an imminent genocide on Orthodox Christians and Kurds, which is kind of in their historical, core competency, if you will. And what I will say about an idea of a pan-Arabist, a pan-Sunni kind of regional thing, is that I would say that, Arabs and Turks are not the same people. And although a lot of people don't think about it this way very often, there is a huge amount of anti-Ottoman historical memory in that region. And if Turkey keeps pushing south, these memories are still very much alive in a great number of people. And I think a lot of Arabs remember how they were treated by the Ottoman Empire. And I don't think it's all smooth sailing. I think that's a major problem to come. And I think Erdogan is reimagining this like neo-Ottomanism is going to fail. And it's going to fail in the Med. The U.S. Navy is massively investing in Greece. Yes. And I think Ottoman's blue homeland aspiration for seizing half the Greek islands is going to result in a Turkish Navy artificial reef program faster than he knows what hit him.
Well, again, I what I'll say to those things is that the Americans reinvesting in Greece is a perfect counterpoint to any adventurism on Erdogan's part.
I wouldn't even say reinvesting though. Like they're not reinvesting. They're investing at a scale they've never invested before. Just to be clear.
Fair point. And the big thing here is this is something I brought up. I'm just going to shift the focus to what happens here with Iran. And one of the things that came up in the conversation that I was having, the private conversation I was having, was that if you look around everything that's happened since October 7th, Iran's the existing, and I don't like to use I guess Khomeiniist as opposed to mullahs, because I hate that term. But that the Khomeiniist wing of
Khamenei or Khomeini?
Khomeini,
like
I
the
guess,
current Khomeini being like Ruhollah,
the Islamic Revolution,
the original, not the current.
Right, not
okay.
Khamenei, but Ayatollah Khomeini from the 70s. That government, that impulse, whatever you want to call it, that group that's in charge, they've taken a lot of punches to the mouth. The IRGC generals have been systematically wiped out, has been taken out, the leadership in the IRGC. Hamas, Hezbollah has been neutered. My question, and while we were going through all this, I said, well, then here's a question for everybody. I think we would be children to say Raisi wasn't murdered. The question isn't whether Raisi was murdered. The question is, with the former president of Iran, the question is, who murdered him? Was it actually reformists within Iran? Because every one of these losses put on the Khomeinists strengthens the reformists within Iran, which then, if that's the case, we could see a political realignment ultimately in Iran, which then has the spillover effect of then backing down the Americans' support of Israel, because Israel no longer has their existential crisis. And in fact, so the whole point of what we're dealing with in Syria today, the framework that I'm operating under, is that everybody's acting the way they are because the two big military players in the region, in the world, the Russians and the Americans, are been forced in or are in there, right, for whatever reason. And we're there as an outgrowth of, or as a consequence and inertia of having adopted British and European foreign policy throughout the 20th century. And we've reached, and it's clear that, and if you listen to Trump and you listen to Tulsi Gabbard, you listen to all of them, they're like, we're done with this. So now, how do the Americans walk away from that region? And if they walk away, then they allow the Russians to walk away. And then everybody who's left has to kind of deal with each other in that way. And it would make perfect sense in that scenario for Erdogan to move into the power vacuum and try and unite in a very broad sense. I'm not saying in any kind of acute, just to elevate the Sunnis, or 1.8 billion people across the world, to say, okay, that's enough, and then we're all done with this crazy Islamist or this crazy Khomeiniism that's coming out of Iran. And at the end of the day, if you remove the Russians and the Americans from the scenario, and I think you and I talked about this the other day, I was like, imagine a demilitarized zone stretching from basically Kaliningrad on the, and St. Petersburg, and then taking a whole slice of the world all the way down to the Gulf of Aden. And we remove basically American and Russian conflict, direct conflict, or by proxy conflict, the entire slice of the world. What does that world look like? Isn't that the framework for a better world? Because everybody eventually then has to deal with each other. We wind up finally, and then what's the grand consequence of this is that we finally undo the terrible nature of Sykes-Picot, which created the current Syria and the current Iraq, both of which are, synthetic countries.
Yeah.
I would broadly. I've said, like, I don't consider Syria and Iraq real countries any more than I consider Ukraine, by its current political borders, a real country. And I'm being blunt and kind of rude about it, but it's it's
well, on that analysis. Where's Prussia? I mean, there's like all sorts of.
Sure.
Where does it end? Like, at some point, it's just we have borders because we have borders. But so I would. So a couple things. I'm broadly skeptical of Erdogan, of all people, being the head of a global Sunni, like going out to Indonesia. Like, no, I don't buy that at all.
I don't buy that either. I think I just think that I think
so let's focus on the area. Like, I also want to say that the American foreign policy in the region is not just the vestiges of the British mandate. We definitely have our own foreign policy, and I think it should be analyzed as such, not viewed as a legacy of the British. And I think all of our lives have been spent, very much in the middle of that applied, whether it's, purely neocon, purely oil. What I would say too is that it's obvious that the Biden and Obama administrations, to be redundant, favored Iran, and Republican administrations going back to Reagan, Bush, both Bushes, and Trump favor Saudi. And obviously the Saudis are Sunni and control, Mecca and Medina, and the Iranians are Shia and, or have been insinuating themselves into the area. But then we have to look back to, back in the Eisenhower administration, when we weren't really, hugely favoring Israel. We were still trying to figure out what's going on. You have to think about how the Soviets were in Egypt, and, how much of Pan-Arabism was really not a religious revolution. And there's just a lot of facts, right? There's all sorts of intrigues over many, many years. I don't know if any of it even matters, but you have to I look at the region as, it's the crossroads of the world in every way. Like all of the it always has been. And so I'm a little skeptical that we're going to have some free trade zone emanating from there, going all the way north to, the Baltics in any way, in any version. I mean, that's a nice idea to think about, but I don't spend a lot of time thinking about it. I think the big thing is, what was the goal of Shia presence in the general Levant area? And how much of it was a legacy of the Soviet Union, where the West and NATO and the UK and the US obviously had over time viewed Israel as their representative in the region, although that history, took a while to express itself. People would be good to go back and look at US-Israeli relations in the 50s and contrast them to now, and they were very different. And but eventually things like control over the Red Sea and other things that happened in the 60s and 70s, that they created the world we all kind of remember from the more recent past, from the 80s onward, let's say. I don't know if fact analysis matters, but I'll tell you what I see right now is Iran has lost massively. They're gone. And whatever ability they have to rebuild is going to be reliant on other people. And if those other people don't pave the way for them, I don't see them being able to do it on their own. That's a new state of affairs. So right now, Iran has the Houthis, and so they have a potential choke point if they want to freak out. But with Trump coming in, what I would say is the Houthis could be eliminated with, like a very focused U.S. purposeful campaign. The idea that the Houthis can't be beaten is just total nonsense. And especially after what's happened here, if people think Iran is going to fight a proxy war with the Houthis against the United States and win, I invite you to take your meds, because that's just a silly thing to think. Right. And at this point, with whatever Israel's doing in Gaza being mostly done, whether any actor likes it or doesn't like it, it is pretty much over. and it's not over, but it's approaching over. And once it's over, the fig leaf of the Houthis' righteous indignation is removed, right? And so if they just start bombing shipping, they're going to get taken out, and they're going to get taken out by large powers who don't care about the side they'll be taking is preserving trade routes. They won't have to pretend they're defending Israel, because at that point the Houthis will just be doing crazy shit, and we'll be like, look, we got to stop them. And then we'll just start flying B-52s over them, and the shit will be over pretty quick. And I know a lot of people fantasize about U.S. weakness. You can still do that, but doing it in this example is dumb. Like, it's just, that's not, if you want to, if you got to do the Scott Ritter nonsense with the U.S. as paper tiger, fine. But, you're really going to tell me the U.S. Navy can't take out the Houthis if they wanted to, and if they were ordered to by President Trump? Like, okay.
Let's just stop there for a second.
But hold on. I just want to wrap up by saying that's the only place that Iran still has influence. So now what? Right? I think, and let me answer my own question here. The thing I worry about is there's nothing stopping Israel from now saying we have to complete the job. And to me, like, you may imagine a peaceful corridor. What I imagine is whatever peace comes is going to happen after Israel does a full-scale attack on Iranian nuclear assets. I think that's what's coming. I think in many ways Trump probably would support it. But more to the point, conditions can be created to allow Trump to support it with probably not that much effort. That's my ultimate, like, throw it all in, shake it up, pour it out. That's what I read in the tea leaves. Okay.
I'm here, by the way, not to disagree with you on this, and that's not, whether it's my preferred outcome here or not is irrelevant.
Just a prediction, not zero value, zero. I am literally just looking at the game board.
This is just pure dispassionate strategic analysis here. What I want to throw into the mix here is to understand what I understand about the Russians, which is when I look at Russian diplomacy, right? The Russians the Russians don't dictate in many ways. Certainly under Lavrov, they don't, and Putin, they don't dictate preferred outcomes. They tell them what they tell their allies, remember, here are your options. We would prefer you to do this, but if you choose option A, which we would prefer, okay, we can do X, Y, and Z. If you don't choose A, then we are going to do B. And in this case, the Russians, I look at the Russians' current relationship with Iran as in terms of securing their trade interests, which is that they want to protect the international north-south transport corridor, right? The Chinese want to protect Belt and Road and Iran is the crossroads there. And I don't think the Russians or the Chinese care who runs Iran, as long as whoever runs Iran protects their interests. So you continue to have relations with Iran. You can have a change at the top of the Iranian political architecture and even change the Iranian state, and the Russians and Chinese may actually be happier about that than they currently are with the people that they're having to make deals with today. They're in effect, and the same thing in effect with Syria. They apparently, from what I understand, they put options in front of Bashar al-Assad about rebuilding Syria 3-4 years ago, and Assad chose not to accept those terms. And they're like, well, okay, well, then this is what's going to happen. And then eventually, Assad was removed from power, and they said, okay, well, we'll protect you and your family. You can't get this narco state. Syria was very corrupt under Assad, and I don't think Assad in many ways had even control over his own government, and he was in many ways kind of a figurehead, certainly in the later stages of all of this. So if that's the case, then the Russians, allowing the current Syrian government to fail, protecting Assad and his family and getting them out of there, and then moving their assets over to Tartus and Yemen and as a first stage, that's fine. On the other side of it, like, look, Iran, we're not having a war with the United States over this. We're not going to give you access. We're not going to give you assets that you're going to use to go fucking crazy with, because you guys can, the current Iranian government can go away, and we can, and quote unquote, the reformists can take over, and we're okay because that actually strengthens our position in the long run, because that de-escalates the bigger conflict that we have with the United States and NATO. So from my perspective, it actually, all of this actually makes sense. And then you have the big question of, to counter your final point of where this winds up. If that is the case, and that's being communicated adequately across all lines, then there's no need for Israel to do this, because there would actually also be to attack Iran's nuclear facilities, because Iran would then would stop moving along that path.
Well, it comes down, I think, to whether you believe that the Mossad pulled off. I mean, there's been a lot of things in the history of ISIS that are very suspicious vis-a-vis what you would expect from an organization like ISIS and their relative hostility towards the state of Israel. It's been insufficient, right? ISIS has been very insufficiently anti-Israel for any, you're like, oh, okay, these guys came out of this region. This is what they believe, but they're just cool with the Jews. How did that happen? Right. And so a lot of people, like a lot of insurgent groups, including Al-Qaeda, and, they wonder, that the origin of ISIS, where it came from. We've talked about this at length. There's a lot of things about when ISIS appeared, and the weapons they used were very obviously wrong. They had AK-74s, which is not an AK-47, uses a different round. They notably didn't have any 20-inch M16s, which would have dovetailed with the explanation of the weapons stores in Iraq that were stolen. But they showed up with M4s, with a whole lot of Colorado-looking, hipster M4-looking Daniel Defense kind of stuff, and EOTechs, and like all this like gun nerd stuff. And you're kind of like, wow, I know what that equipment looks very familiar. That's weird. And then, the other half of ISIS shows up with nothing but AK-74s, which don't use the most common round in the entire region, to the tunes of hundreds of millions of rounds sitting in boxes in Syria and Iraq. And they're like, oh, no, we're not going to use those. We're going to use this pain in the ass specialty round, that basically the Russian special forces uses. Now, I know it's more, the 5.45 is more common than that, but compared to 7.62 by 39, ain't nothing, is not exotic, right? We have common, and then we have everything else, and they used nothing. It's like, what is up with this? So, I mean, I have a lot of issues with ISIS and its whole history, but look, the other obvious option for Iran is a color revolution. And I don't think Mossad, that's our thing, not their thing. So, but I do think Bibi is on a kinetic tear, and so the Syria corridor is now open, and they can refuel over it, and that changes the attack they can pull off on Iran by a lot. Because if they don't have to refuel over Saudi while saying they're not doing it, but got news for you, they were doing it, and come in from the north by just shooting across northern Iraq. After refueling over Syria, doing whatever missions they got to do, getting back into Syrian airspace, refueling, and then going home. Like, that's a whole different ops plan. Look, I just think Israel can't resist it. No, I'm not, again, and at the same time, don't think that doesn't mean that simultaneously, with or without coordination, the CIA isn't going to try to do a color revolution, and this time not leave them hanging out like they did during Obama, when, honestly, the whole world had a chance to have a much more productive future. The whole last 10 years would have been a lot different had Obama supported, the uprisings in Iran, and, but he didn't. Nope. Because there's been a lot of questionable connections between the people who ran the Obama/Biden administrations and the ruling class in Iran. Take it or leave it,
Yeah, no, I know it's a mess. And,
now, if we don't wind up in an immediate kinetic situation in relation to Iran's nukes program, then I can see a lot of peace breaking out, and I could see Trump. The whole other way of looking at this is, a reasonable peace in Ukraine is accepted by by a chase in Europe who is scared of Trump and has realized they can't pay for this or facilitate pushing Russia out of the Novorossiya region. Let's just whatever Russia's not going to come to the table and be like, oh yeah, we'll just take the Donbass and Crimea and walk away from the last. That's not happening.
Right.
And although, that's what the West thinks they can induce. I think the trade is, and again, this comes back to the two bases, right? If Russia had no presence in Syria, they're going to be even more, I think, more stubborn at the negotiating table. But I don't think they're not going to be. They're going to be stubborn either way. And I don't know. The West is trying to get their best possible deal, and whatever happens, happen. You also, like, how controlled is HTS? Like, right. I don't think you should not afford them some degree of autonomy and an agency that, like, once you're in charge, you're in charge. And
again, we're just this is all conjecture. This is all
right, because the facts are not. There's so much bullshit out there right now. Right. All we can do is look at what we look at. Look at we can get the actors are clear. Like, we know that Turkey's involved. We know that Israel's involved. We just don't know how much, in the sense of, or with which
and
group.
Whether they're even coordinating. They could each be moving into the vacuum in Syria for different reasons.
It's just risk.
And those different reasons could be that Israel's trying to land grab because they don't want Erdogan to take more territory than they. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, we don't have to posit anything more than people are moving into a vacuum.
Right, and if he proceeds to start genociding the Kurds, it'll explain. So recent, fake rapprochement inside Turkish politics, where the Kurds have been empowered. Like, if he goes into erstwhile Kurdistan / northern Syria / newly southern Turkey, whatever he sees it as, and proceeds to massacre the entire Kurdish population, well, I got news for you. He's going to have an internal civil war.
Bingo. Right. So he has to play his cards very, very carefully in that respect as well. So it's going to be, So let's just leave it there and see how things play out. And we'll come revisit this in, a month or 6 weeks or whatever, and after Trump is inaugurated, hopefully. And just so everybody knows, every day I raise my probability that Trump is going to take office by 1% per day, and I'm doing that mostly to check my own enthusiasm for this new timeline. I'm doing this on purpose. I'm, like, refusing to allow myself to get carried away with any sense of optimism, because I can see all the optimism. I've been talking to a couple of different people about this all, I've been talking about this all week in many ways. And so, like, to me, every day that Trump is alive and things are moving forward and we see these things occurring, even while all these other, things are, the realignments are happening, every day we get closer to him actually walking up to the podium on January 20th, putting his hand on the Bible and doing the thing and sworn in as the 47th president. I see all of these people, and I see all the stuff that we've talked about today, and their next move is, how the fuck can we stop this? Because Europe and the UK are the big losers in everything we've discussed today. And so they're going to try and continue to do something in order to create facts that Trump can't ignore. That plan has not stopped. So,
to sort of one massive deficit that I just want to fill in real quickly, because we are going to have to revisit this. I don't know, in probably about 2 months. Sure. And my basic thesis is, Trump and Republican administrations are more Saudi / Gulf state centered, and Biden, Obama are more Iran centered. So the East Med pipeline, I view, is not going to happen, but the pipeline that will happen runs roughly from Qatar across the southern border of Iraq inside Saudi Arabia, and then draw a straight line up so that you only have to go through Jordan once. Don't go so far west that you have to go through Jordan twice. But so just draw a straight line right through mid Syria, right into Turkey, and then shoot that across the Bosporus into Bulgaria, roughly. You'll probably find a map of this. That pipeline, the Trans-Syria pipeline, is now totally on deck again. And we'd be fools not. I mean, we're fools not to have put that first on the list when it comes to the way we see the world, right? Like, first things first. I was like, how do we not mention this? That I think is, especially the more you know about the East Med pipeline, it's a pipeline of philosophical existence and not real existence. So I'd be really shocked to see them throw a pipe, across the north of Crete I think it goes from Lebanon to Cyprus crosses across the north of Crete and winds up in the southern Peloponnesos around Monemvasia in Greece, and then goes up from there. But I don't think that happens at all, even if it's nat gas only, because the Bulgarians already have the pathway up the coast there. And if they put this new pipeline that I'm talking about in Syria through Turkey, it changes everything. And the key thing in all European thinking is denying the pricing of the marginal therm or the marginal barrel of oil from Russia. It doesn't mean that Russia can't be a participant in the market, but to me, Russia is going to be forced into giving discounted oil as part of its reparations package. In order for us to close this war, Russia's going to get territory. They're going to wind up thinking they won, and then the Euros are going to just take it out of them in energy. And, Putin might be okay with that. He might not be happy, but no one's going to be happy.
Or he literally says, you get to keep the $210 billion you stole from us. And on this point,
I'm just assuming that at some point, somebody in Russia is going to want economic development and peace, whether it's Putin or whoever influences Putin. And listen, all of what we do at Gold Goats and Guns, honestly, at some level, is about economic development and commodity flow. Yes. Right? Like that's what we talk about, and that's what we write about. And yes, we do a lot of domestic politics and culture because it's fun. But in terms of the investment focus of the newsletter, I mean, it's a lot of it is about these flows in this area of the world. And I hope that one day it's not all about war. At some point, controlling commodity flow should be about economic development. And this last couple of years in Ukraine has been a disaster for a great number of people. Nobody wins this.
No, I know. What's interesting, and this is a last point on this, because this is very important, which is that the Russia of 2015 and the Russia of 2024 are different people. They have different incentives. They had to move into Syria in 2015 because they didn't have any security about the existing pipeline network. Nord Stream hadn't quite been built yet. Blah, 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 blah. And now in 2024, they have different relationships around the world. They signed a big energy deal with Rosneft and India just signed a big deal. They've got Power Siberia 1. They're going to do Power Siberia 2. They've got other contracts. They've got Turkstream is up and running. They've got all these things. So they can give up and allow other pipelines to go into Europe in such a way that, and I'll be honest with you, I think they're happy with it at this point because they don't want to deal with the fucking Europeans anymore. Right. So the pipeline from Qatar into Bulgaria is actually a path to peace for everybody. And oh, by the way, even the Brits are happy about this because, of course, Qatar is a friggin' British thing. The British are gonna get something out of this. And when I look at all of this and I can start to map whose relationships are with whom across the region, I'm like, oh, what we just laid out, everybody gets a little bit of a gib here. And right. that's the kind of framework that leads to an agreement that everybody takes a small bite off the shit sandwich and then they walk away mostly happy and slightly unhappy.
Well, and more to the point, if Europe's energy needs are met by Russia through Belarus and Ukraine pipelines, through Germany from US LNG transfer pipelines, and through Turkey/Bulgaria from Saudi, and Emirates and et cetera pipeline, you now have plurality of energy supply in Europe, which means they can survive without Russia, which also means maybe a new generation can realize that Russia's, the idea of Russia turning off the gas and having them by the balls, if that's removed, then so too can be removed the paranoia about Russia's influence, and maybe just be like, hey, maybe they just live over there and we can trade with them. Now that's going to be 10 years of undoing the last 10 years. But the first part is the infrastructure, because if in the reality of Russia controlling the flow, it's a temptation for both sides, a temptation for Russia to use that influence, and it's also a temptation to descend into paranoia on Europe, and frankly, like, if you know anything about the Russian military, the idea of them invading Europe is just like, dude, like,
it's ludicrous. I mean, that's the right word for it. It's just ludicrous, and it is paranoid. It is nothing but a fucking talking point that is designed to create a political agenda. That's all it is. The Russians have absolutely they have no desire to rule over Europeans who hate them. They have no desire, frankly, to rule over Ukrainians who hate them.
They can't manage a 200-mile military supply chain. What makes you think they can manage an 800-mile one? Like, exactly. Sorry.
This goes all the way back to stuff that Andrei the Saker wrote about fucking 10 years ago, saying, look, the Russians are only interested in 600, basically 600 miles from their border. If you look at the way the security architecture is designed, all their weapon systems, all of the rest of it, it's all about within 600 miles of their border. And Syria is literally the edge of their ability to force project.
Well, the key thing is, let's hope Donald Trump doesn't make antagonizing the Russians a key point of his administration. I do not think he will. The absence of that, I think, can really be a motivation towards peace. And on the other hand, I hope that Jay Powell helps bring us a 95-cent euro, which should help us recalibrate the attitude of Europe broadly. Because with those two elements, we can have the idea of peace on the horizon, even if it's on the 8 or 10-year horizon.
Sure.
But, the Europeans need to be broken of their will. Like, that's what needs to happen. And all the pieces are lined up for that. So as long as we can prevent an actual broad kinetic war far in excess of what we've been seeing in Ukraine from breaking out, I think, Europe is going to be humbled.
In a way that and if everything we've just kind of laid out comes to pass, then there will be a framework for the new generations of Europeans who, if you look at the demographics of the way they're voting, is what they want. Then that's what we're looking at for the future. So let's hope that we're right about a lot of this, and that this is the way this plays out. So we'll leave it there. This timeline is very interesting, and we'll see how it plays out from here. And we'll wait for the next inflection point and to see what timeline we superimpose ourselves into.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dexter, and thank you for putting up with my inability to.
It's been a fun 3 hour, 90 minutes.
All right, we'll leave it there. You guys be well. You take care. We'll talk soon.
Ciao.